Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening. Kicking off on Monday. Welcome to the show. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. Chris Bowen has unveiled Labor's vehicle efficiency standard over the weekend, and much like Bowen's other announcements, this one seems based more on hope than hard data. But Australians will take up his electric vehicles. We'll get you the facts that Bowen doesn't want to talk about tonight with drive motoring expert Paul Gover. Farmers are set to head to Canberra tomorrow to protest against Labor's renewables rollout, running roughshod over rural land and communities. Tonight we'll hear from one such farmer pushing back against a massive solar development right near his property. Plus, we'll cross live to the UK, where concerns about unchecked immigration have reignited in recent days after an asylum seeker allegedly attacked multiple people in an acid attack. Now, rejected as a refugee multiple times, you'll be shocked to find out how he was eventually allowed to stay in Britain. And while Parliament didn't sit today, it's back in full swing tomorrow. It's clear what will dominate the first week back for 2024. Right now, the Shadow Cabinet is meeting to mull over Labor's Stage 3 tax betrayal.
Will they be bought? Will they have their integrity sold to them for $15 a week? I don't think so.
100% of Australians hate being lied to. That I can absolutely categorically say.
Even if you get more dollars in the hip pocket?
Well, you never trust that guy again.
Promising over 100 times since the last election you'll keep it and you break your word. It takes a while for that to sink in.
But first, today's news poll, first for the year, is bad news for a government and a Prime Minister that needed a poll boost after shredding their own credibility.
My word is my bond. I can confirm that we haven't changed our position. We have no change to our plans. Tax cuts will happen in July.
Now, yes, polls are often a lagging indicator, and I think more and more this is the case. But on today's result, the mother of all broken promises has been all pain and no gain for Anthony Albanese. That line, "My word is my bond," will haunt him forever. For no poll bounce, the same 52-48 outcome now as before Christmas. And sure, more people than not think it was right to give more to lower income earners, but that doesn't mean they'll forgive the Prime Minister for breaking a promise he repeated more than 100 times. Especially for a tax cut worth around $15 a week that doesn't even begin until mid-year. And of course, that $15 will evaporate pretty quickly this week anyway, as the government puts petrol up with its automatic indexing of the tax we pay to Canberra, soon to be almost 50 cents per litre. For the past fortnight since it broke its word, Labor's been trying to make this tax cuts problem the opposition's issue, trying to pitch itself as the battler's friend and Peter Dutton and the Liberals as the friends of privilege. As we go to air tonight, as I mentioned, the coalition hasn't finalised its response. It's in a shadow cabinet meeting. But I can't see Peter Dutton falling for the obvious trap this dishonest government is trying to set. Here's the frontbencher Jane Hume today saying that the coalition is always in favour of lower taxes.
We wanted to make taxes lower, simpler and fairer. And in fact,
so why wouldn't you support it?
Well, and we will always be the party of lower taxes. That I can assure you.
This week in the Parliament, we're going to see a fight between the government and the opposition as to who has the prevailing narrative. Was it that the PM broke his word because he had to? Or did he break his word because he was playing politics? Now, in a campaigning sense, the real problem for the government is less about this broken promise and more about any promises the government will make in the future. If they've lied here, if this was a calculated, cunning move, then voters will always doubt whether they can trust the Prime Minister's word into the future. And that's the issue that Labor strategists will be sweating on as polls play out in coming weeks, particularly the by-election in Dunkley in Melbourne on March the 2nd. Now, in the end, I reckon it's the Prime Minister's broken promise that will be remembered a whole lot longer than that $15 by voters. Over the weekend too, the government flagged legislation later in the year to lower the overall carbon dioxide emissions of Australia's overall car fleet. Now, naturally, Chris Bowen claimed that Labor's changes would save money.
Why don't they want rural and regional voters to get the savings from having more efficient vehicles? The more you drive, the more you pay at the Bowser. The more efficient your vehicle is, the more your savings. Actually, rural and regional motorists would be big winners out of the introduction of new vehicle efficiency standards.
I mean, we've all heard this before from Labor, haven't we? I mean, Bowen is the same clown who told us that the government's move to 82% renewable power by 2030 would cut your power bill, that they'd also save Australians $275 per household per year. We all know what's happened, don't we? Household power bills have gone up at least 20% on Labor's watch. And you can be confident it will be exactly the same with the car you drive. All electric vehicles are still roughly double the price of a comparable petrol or diesel car. Most have a range that's still little more than 400 kilometres, and they take at least an hour to recharge, even on a fast charger. Now, the cars that Australians most want to drive, like the Ford Ranger Ute, are the high-emitting ones that Bowen and his government wants to force off our roads. In order to supposedly save the planet, the government will force this change by requiring car companies to lower the emissions of their overall car sales. Essentially, it'll mean that petrol and diesel sales will subsidise the sale of electric cars. And naturally, it's Labor, there'll be a complicated system of credits. Your petrol ute will cost more so that your neighbour's buzzbox of a Nissan Leaf will cost them less.
We can't let ideology get in the road of practical reality. If you take away particularly utes, they're tools of trade, particularly for people, not just tradies in the cities, but also people in the bush. And if you put a tonne on the back of an electric ute at the moment, you don't get far. And then if you put a trailer on the back of it, towing another tonne, you get even shorter distances.
And those tradies driving around in a Ford truck will end up subsidising well-heeled Tesla drivers. Now, not surprising, the Chamber of Automotive Industries is demanding the Minister release the modelling, which to date he refuses to do.
The question I have is, are we able, as you put in your intro, able to actually improve the efficiency of our vehicles by 60% in just 5 years? Now, we didn't see the modelling, and the modelling hasn't been released, as I understand it, by the government. So we'll be very interested to see that modelling, but it's going to be a big task.
More secrecy and just more green madness from a government and from a minister in Chris Bowen with a proven record of failure. Worst record in Australia's history when he was Immigration Minister. The bloke who went after your investment property as Treasurer and now wants to tell you what car you're allowed to drive. Sorry, but in my book, 3 strikes and surely you're out. Well, we've all heard about Holocaust denial, the lie that Hitler murdering some 6 million Jews was somehow made up, fabricated, despite the evidence at Auschwitz and many of the other extermination camps. Well, how about this latest version of denying what plainly happened here in this country less than 6 months ago? Now, you and I know the disgraceful scenes at the Opera House on October 9. We know what they are. Here they are again. You heard it, I heard it, gas the Jews. But apparently now, all these months on, the New South Wales Police didn't hear it. They gave this footage to some so-called expert who came back to them apparently saying that what we all heard wasn't actually what was said. Now here that is again. Gas the Jews, pretty clear to me, but the so-called expert says he didn't hear it. He reckons it was, where's the Jews? So where's the Jews? That's okay then? Even though hunting for Jews and then killing them was exactly what Hamas had done just a day or so earlier. And on that basis, naturally, there's no hate speech and no need for New South Wales Police to prosecute anyone. Now, honestly, if people made this up, you'd laugh at them. But these are the depths to which anti-Jewish hate has permeated this country. And for that now to reach our police, Well, it's almost shameful. It's almost as shameful as the mobs putting their race hate on display. All right, Parliament back this week. Not today. Kicks off tomorrow. Here's Trudy McIntosh now with the headlines.
Australian writer Yang Hengjun has been given a suspended death sentence by China. The Foreign Minister publicly condemned the verdict, which effectively means Dr Yang faces life behind bars.
The Australian government is appalled at this outcome. We will be communicating our response in the strongest terms.
More than 4 years after he was detained and charged with espionage, Dr Yang has been handed a suspended death sentence by a Chinese court. It could be downgraded to life behind bars after a 2-year period. A spokesperson for his family revealing they're shocked and devastated by the news. They say it comes at the extreme end of the worst expectations. The Foreign Minister directed her departmental secretary to summon China's ambassador in Canberra to a meeting at the department this afternoon. This, no doubt, a setback in the Albanese government's push to stabilise the relationship with Beijing. And MPs return to Canberra ahead of the first sitting week of the year. And surprise, surprise, tax cuts will dominate the discussion this week. The Prime Minister receiving a standing ovation at the Labor caucus meeting this afternoon.
The childcare workers, the truck drivers. You can't say, oh, we thank you for getting us through the pandemic, and then say, no, but you don't deserve a tax cut. You're not aspirational enough.
The opposition is still wrestling with whether to back changes to the already legislated Stage 3 tax relief. Shadow Cabinet meeting today ahead of the Coalition's party room meeting tomorrow morning.
We will continue to prosecute the case on how Labor should be managing the economy. And meanwhile, we'll come to a sensible decision on how to deal with Labor's failure.
The Treasurer is daring the Coalition to vote against the additional relief for Middle Australia in Parliament.
Whatever the Coalition party room decides, they've already shown that they are diabolically out of touch with Middle Australia and the communities that they are supposed to represent.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
All right, as I mentioned in my editorial there, Anthony Albanese's plan to trade his credibility in the hope he might woo voters with Labor's revised tax cuts, well, that's fallen flat in today's news poll. For more, and I'm delighted to say he's back for 2024, I'm joined now by National Editor for The Australian, Dennis Shanahan. Well, we've missed you here on Credlin, Dennis. Great to have you back as Parliament kicks off for the year. Give us your sense. You know, this is a major election promise. Not a couple of times he said it, over 100 times. My word is my bond, all of that. The prize for Australians is around $15 a week back from July. And all the PM's got here for shredding his credibility is this 1-point bump in the polls. Give us your take on what's really been a momentous start to this year, hasn't it?
Well, it certainly has been a momentous start, and Anthony Albanese started his political year about the middle of December. It was clear that the Prime Minister was aware of falling public support and the need to actually do something about cost of living relief for Middle Australia. He campaigned like an election campaign, travelling the country, giving press releases and interviews all over the place. And what he did promise first up in his first press conference was that there would be cost of living relief in the budget. Then he announced that there would in fact be a rewriting of the Stage 3 tax cuts, a completely broken promise, one that he'd pledged a number of times, one that he clearly misled people about, and which he completely overturned, and which is now the whole point of the parliamentary sitting this week. So what he has done here is he has decided he had to be seen to be doing something. He was afraid of spending too much money and fueling inflation, so he has conflated the tax cuts with addressing inflation, and he's now broken a promise that he's made a number of times, and also in a fairly dodgy way misled the public and everyone else about his intentions. But what the news poll has shown today is that more than 2/3 of people have said, well, they think it's about the right thing to do because it's going to give more help to people on lower incomes. And look, I think given that there was virtually no change, it's essentially the same news poll on all the numbers that it was in December last year, that while it's not a bump at all, but I think something that Labor would be pleased about, because what they were looking at and what Anthony Albanese was afraid of was actually a further fall in the polls at the beginning of this year, and that could have led him down a losing trajectory, as it did for Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. So I think that Labor will be pleased at least with no change in the polls, but it has cost an enormous amount for Anthony Albanese's credibility, for some of the taxpayers, and also for the long-term strategy which the coalition will exploit.
And I would argue, as I did at the top of the show, I mean, that's actually the blood price they've paid. Are they happy to have paid that price? Well, we'll see in coming news polls. But, I mean, once you shred the PM's credibility, very hard to get that back. And it means, forget this promise, every other promise from here on in will have voters questioning, am I actually going to see it? Do they really mean it? And I like you saying that this all started in December, because you must have been watching a Treasury committee debates today, as I was. I mean, Jane Hume really went after the Treasury officials. It was revealed, of course, that these tax cuts were reworked in December last year. Labor, you remember, going into Christmas, had that horror couple of weeks of the Parliament over all those detainees released. I mean, it was just like Keystone Cop sort of stuff. So they started on this in December, yet we have the Prime Minister, as recently, I think about the 14th of January, out there saying, no, back them in, not going to change, I'll deliver them. This is what voters hate to see, this sort of planned duplicity.
Well, indeed, and it is duplicitous, and it is clear from what the Prime Minister and the Treasurer were saying publicly that what Treasury was doing was something else completely different. That Treasury, today we hear from the Senate Estimates Committees, and as well the timeline says it all, that this huge tax reform, and this is stage 3 of the tax reform that began first in 2018, and all of a sudden, in just a couple of weeks, Treasury is able to rework it completely. And in a couple of days, the government is able to accept this surprise advice from the Treasury and say, yes, get it done and dusted through the Cabinet, through the caucus, through the Expenditure Review Committee, and announce it. And here we have Parliament ready to look at it tomorrow. So it is an extraordinarily misleading behaviour from the government. And of course, they're trying to push it back onto the Liberals and say, oh no, circumstances changed and we had to make a hard decision. This hasn't been a hard decision. It's not a hard decision to give a whole lot of people extra money. That's an easy decision to make. The hard decision is actually to try and keep down spending and create savings to actually finance those tax cuts, as well as including a $28 billion benefit from bracket creep over the next 10 years. I mean, to describe this as reform or anything else is a nonsense.
ASIC reports today there's about 3,000 businesses that went bust in the December quarter, and that's significant. Construction, predominantly, hospitality, retail. The building giant today, we learned, St Hilliers, it went into administration. There is concern, you know, when you talk about tax cuts, sure, there's small and medium-term businesses out there now, scaled businesses, heavy employers of Australians, doing it really tough. We can see that in the stats. So the government spends about $500,000 to get all the MPs, the Labor MPs, to Canberra during January for that caucus summit and cost of living. Now, if you're in a pub tonight, your beer's a little bit more expensive. You're going to fill up the car tomorrow and you're going to pay almost 50% now in tax to the government per litre of fuel. You've got to ask yourself, when they all came to Canberra in January and had this cost of living summit, why wasn't something like this automatic indexation of excise in these areas, why wasn't that on the table, Dennis? Because remember when John Howard was in trouble, 2001 I think it was, Aston by-election about this time in the year, he did something about petrol indexation. It saved him in Aston and it also helped him win later on the year in the general election. We know there's a Dunkley by-election around the corner. I think they're bleeding on these sorts of genuine cost of living at the till, at the Bowser sort of issues. they're not going to see much from these tax cuts, and they are months away.
Well, indeed. And look, the so-called cost of living summit was a charade. It was there to lock in the rest of the Labor with the decision by the Prime Minister and the Treasurer to change the tax cuts. That's all it was about. It was like locking them in on the voice to Parliament. They are all now one. There can be no critics. They are locked in. And what else did they look at? Did they look at the cost of energy, the real driving cost for businesses, which is driving people to the wall? Increasingly, we are going to see more and more businesses, particularly restaurants and people in the hospitality areas, going to the wall because, well, yes, inflation has started to slow down. Good news, but there's a lag of months, up to 12 months, while we'll see building construction firms and others go under. And yet at that cost of living summit, all they did was tick the change to the tax stage 3 tax cuts, and they didn't address all of the other issues, including petrol, power, all these other forces on inflation and the cost of living. Not a word. All we heard was, yes, we've changed the Scott Morrison tax cuts.
We called it a stunt at the time, Dennis, and you just backed that in. You're right, absolutely right. Thank you. Great to have you back on Credlin. All right, let's go to the other issue of the weekend, those vehicle standards. Chris Bowen back on his green energy bandwagon. Now, he claims this is all about choice for consumers. He says it'll actually make your motoring cheaper. Well, come on, you said you'd make our power cheaper with renewables, and we know how that turned out last time. To get into the detail now, I'm joined by veteran motoring journalist Paul Gover. Paul, great to have you back on the program. Give us an understanding of this energy standard. And look, how on earth is this supposed to save the motorist $1,000 each?
Well, taking the second point first, it won't and it can't. Anytime they change anything on new cars, it costs more money. So basically, the energy standard is a standard that's been in effect in Europe for some time. There are a number of emission levels. It just brings us into line with a more recent standard, not something that's proposed for the future. What Minister Bowen has completely forgotten about is that the reason we couldn't have this standard up until now has got nothing to do with electric cars. It's got to do with the fact that the fuel in Australia is not suitable for use with those European latest emission standards. The cars simply don't run properly on it. So which came first, the fuel or the announcement? Well, it's got to be the fuel first, because you can't change the emission standards for these vehicles without the correct fuel.
What about the point that Australians, and we talked about this when you were last on, certainly we're seeing it out of the United States, but people are not buying electric vehicles. I mean, for all the hype, the early adopters are there, people with plenty of Tesla cash in their pocket are there, but the vast bulk of Australians are not purchasing them. They made up, well, 7.2%, I'm told, of new car sales last year. What happens here if we're being pushed towards a vehicle we don't want and we don't buy it? We're not going to see a saving here.
No, and the other thing is, this isn't about getting people to buy it. The vast majority of Australians don't want an electric car. Most of them also can't afford an electric car. The sort of people that he's trying to convince with all of this sort of stuff, they can't afford any sort of new car. So saying you're going to save $1,000 when you buy a new car, that's great. The vast majority of Australians are going to hang on to what they've got, or they're moving into a second-hand car, not necessarily new cars. The thing about this is,
and Paul,
electric cars.
Let me just jump into remind people what we are buying. Remind people what we're buying, because we're actually getting bigger in our vehicle choices, not smaller, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. So the pickup trucks, I don't call them utes because they're not based on the Falcon and Commodore anymore, but the vast majority of Australians want a pickup truck. They want a Toyota Hilux or a Ford Ranger. And the fact is, they're outselling traditional passenger cars. Passenger cars are just about dead in Australia because the people who are not buying pickups are buying big SUVs, big family vans. Now, these things are heavier and are worse for the environment in all sorts of ways. So we're just jumping around the edges. Now, there are electric cars out there that will do some of the functions of an SUV, but they're more expensive than buying a combustion engine car. And right at the minute, there's only one electric pickup truck available in Australia. You talk about sales, guess what happened last year? 87 was the total number of sales for the LDV electric pickup truck in Australia last year.
Good Lord, it didn't even crack the ton. Hey, just quickly, I mean, if Australians aren't buying these cars, Chris Bowen says it's going to save us $1,000. We both dispute that, as do the experts. But I listened to the Federal Chamber of Automotive out there today. They're saying, well, if we're going to make this sort of saving, Minister, put the modelling out there, because he hasn't even put the modelling out there in the public domain so that experts like you and others can scrutinise it. Does that surprise you? Because that says to me, coming out of politics, that something's crook if they don't put the modelling out there.
I would suggest there is no modelling. This is just a number he's plucked out of the air somewhere, a bit like an episode of one of those TV shows about what's the ka-ching number that's going to get people to pay attention. And I think the other thing about this is you can legislate all you like in a country like Australia that we should be driving these sort of cars, but buyers don't want them. They're not buying them, and they show no signs of buying them anytime in the future.
Paul Glover, so much common sense. Thank you very much for unpacking the sort of Bowenisms we've been copying for the last 24 hours. Thanks for your time. All right, after the break, a massive protest tomorrow against the imposition of renewables. It'll be in Canberra. I'll speak to one of the farmers who will be there, who says enough's enough. Plus, after a shocking acid attack in London in recent days, the debate over who's been granted asylum has once again been reignited. Welcome back. Look, shortly we'll go to London for the latest on that horrid acid attack, with the suspect bringing into question the worth of UN refugee rules and potential new loopholes that are being exploited. But first, tomorrow farmers and regional Australians are set to hit Canberra in the protest against state and federal government imposition of renewable projects on prime agricultural land. Now, something we've discussed repeatedly here on Credlin, the government's green agenda being imposed on large tracts of mostly private agricultural land. We know in order to reach the lofty goal of 82% renewables by 2030, and we are a long way behind, they're going to need to install 22,000 solar panels a day, 40 large wind turbines a month, plus build 10,000 plus kilometres of new transmission lines. We're told, and it always costs more, we're told it'll cost consumers around $80 billion. One of the farmers who's been working tirelessly to hold the government to account is Stan Moore, who's the group Save Gaundrey Plains, has turned the spotlight on a plan to install 700 hectares of solar panels smack bang in the middle of prime farmland just outside of Goulburn. I'm pleased to say Stan joins me now. Well, Stan, I read a piece you and a fellow Goulburn local, Louise Clegg, wrote in the Weekend Australian. Harrowing stuff, because I'll get to the ownership. That's the important thing. I want to get to the ownership of this project in a moment, but give my viewers a sense of the scale. Say they're not from a country area. What's the impact of this on farming land and your local community?
Well, it's clearly a large visual impact. What they're proposing is amongst a number of rural lifestyle blocks. The scale really gets you in that it's 700 hectares, that is 7 square kilometres. But added to that, we've also got another proposal of a similar size. So right across the floor of Gunderi Plains, there will be 15 square kilometres of solar panels, 1.6 million of them, they are 5 metres high. And now that has a massive impact on not just the rural outlets, the noise, those sorts of things, but also the value of our properties to the neighbours and near neighbours in the area. And that's causing a lot of anxiety amongst a number of people. Just on the Gunderi one alone, there are some 60 residents that are impacted by that.
All right, talk to me now about the ownership point, because I think that was perhaps the most powerful revelation in what I read on the weekend, because this might have started out as a project owned by BP and put up by BP, but that's not the ownership structure now, is it?
Well, BP is still involved in the Gundary one. It is still at the development stage. There's still no EIS, but the company that is doing the proposal is Lightsource Development Australia. That is owned by Lightsource BP, which is now 100% owned by BP, British Petroleum. BP has a record of developing solar factories in Australia. It's one of the largest developers. And just before Christmas, it sold their total stock, 5 existing solar factories in New South Wales and Queensland. They sold them to the Beijing Energy Company. So they have not, as they've told us, they will come in, they'll build it, they'll own, they'll operate, etc. At the first chance they flick them off. Now, this is not uncommon. You see it happening with the wind turbines and with solar panels. Some of them we've up to over 3 new owners since they were first commissioned.
And the worry here, Stan, for people at home to understand is you only get about 15 years out of a wind turbine. I mean, Siemens, who manufactures them out of Germany, has set that 15-year figure. We know it's about 2025, depending on the scale of the solar panel, these industrial solar panels. But then there's a remediation required of the land. I mean, who takes away and recycles all of that material? You've got issues when the wind and the sun can't get to that land for the 25 years it's been covered by a solar panel. There's compacted earth. It's not the same agricultural land. I mean, you can't graze on it, all of these things. I mean, is there a remediation plan, and how much confidence do you have in it?
Well, it's not, I haven't got much confidence at all in any remediation plan that's been approved. And in our case, it'll be the New South Wales Department of Planning. What they tend to do is with the existing developer, they will say, oh, we need to have a clause in there where you'll, remediate. And basically they say, oh, yes, we'll decommission these sites. And that is to the developer at the time. But there is nothing stopping that developer selling those properties with or the operation. And who, in the end, is going to be the party responsible for the remediation. And given they change hands quite frequently, I can assure you, or it would appear to be the sensible thing to do if you were the owner of these facilities, when they come up for decommissioning, remediation, rehabilitation, it'll be a company that's got no asset backing, and it'll just fold and leave it there, probably for the taxpayer. Our concern is that it probably won't happen in my time, but in our children and their children, they will be left with the graveyard of 1.6 million solar panels in the paddock right beside us.
Stan, I'll leave it there. I know you're heading to Canberra tomorrow. I'm going to check in with your group and your protest tomorrow. All the very best. And thank you for, again, pushing this issue out in the public domain. If you at home, you want to find out a little bit more, Gundary Plains, savegundaryplains.com.au. Head there and get some information, get involved, start the fight back against this stuff. All right, let's go now to the UK, where in recent days we saw a shocking attack in southwest London with a woman and 2 young children allegedly doused in acid, with the woman now expected to suffer life-changing injuries. The suspect of this heinous attack is still at large, but what we do know is that he's a convicted sex offender, having been convicted for sexual assault and exposure. He's understood to have arrived in the UK illegally in 2016. He failed to gain asylum on 2 attempts. He finally got it granted in 2020, though, after he claimed he'd converted from Islam to Christianity. For more on this, I'm joined now by political editor at The Express Online, David Maddox. David, great to see you. Thank you for catching up with me in London. I'm delighted to have you on the show this year. I read this with horror, given this bloke had tried to be accepted as a refugee, had gone through all the processes and the second go attempts we give them in Western countries and had been knocked back. But he gets asylum and then this happens.
Well, hi, Peter. It's great to be on your show. Look, this story, I'm afraid, tells you everything that is wrong with national and international law regarding illegal migration. We've been desperately trying to control it in this country now for quite a number of years. It's almost impossible to control the borders. You know, this guy should have been deported 8 years ago when he first arrived on these shores. Should have been deported again 6 years ago when he was found guilty of a sexual offence. I mean, it's mind-boggling. But, you know, it comes down to the UN Refugee Convention. It comes down to the European Convention of Human Rights. It's almost impossible to take on the kind of left-wing lawyers who, you know, try to stop these guys from being, you know, evicted from this country, you know. And then, of course, you mentioned the Christianity conversion, which looks as though it's probably bogus, but, you know, we'll find out. But the Church of England has a really sinister role in all of this. They've been actively trying to stop any new laws to allow us to deport illegal migrants, because we have bishops in Parliament still from a sort of medieval hangover. And they're actively kind of helping and protecting illegal migrants by, you know, by doing this conversion business to Christianity, to say, oh, that means they can't go back. It's mad. You know, the whole thing's mad.
The real worry with all of that, though, David, is he tests the UN against a refugee claim that gets knocked back. He then loses character by being convicted of sex offences. Fair enough, he should go. And then the last roll of the dice is this conversion to Christianity, which I have to say is a bit of a new route for people who've exhausted everything else. Sometimes they claim to be gay, sometimes they claim a Christian conversion. This is used at the very, very last throw of the dice, and in this case it's worked. This loophole has to be closed, surely. I mean, you guys are in a world of pain on the migration issue, but if this opens up, I don't know how you stop it.
Well, it's becoming increasingly frequent that this is being used. And yeah, we are in a world of pain. We're literally hundreds of small boats coming across the English Channel from France every day, but, you know, through illegal migrants coming through other means as well, mainly our airports, actually. And but they're using, certainly this Christianity conversion excuse is now becoming much more common. I'm guessing they're crossing their fingers when they're doing it. But it's, yeah, the loophole's got to be closed. But frankly, I don't know how we can close the loophole unless we effectively block international law through the UN Refugee Convention and through the European Convention of Human Rights, which basically protect these guys.
I might add, there's a provision in Islam where you're allowed to do whatever it takes. Commit crimes, lie, pretend to be another faith if that furthers the cause of Islam. So if this bloke was making it up, you think it might be bogus, I don't know, but if he was making it up, he would still be on the right side of Islam. Before I go, and I've got you now, give us a sense of what these pro-Palestinian protests are like in London, because when I was there, I couldn't believe how big they were. They certainly hadn't abated. We were talking about 100,000 at one stage. I'm still seeing crowds of at least 20,000 gathering for the speeches in London. Where are Londoners with all of this? Is there still support, David?
Well, I mean, Palestine is a really totemic issue for the left. I've never really quite put my finger on why. I assume it's because Israel is so closely associated with America. I think that's part of it. But yeah, week in, week out, the centre of London is basically taken over by these protests. It says a lot about the left in this country. There's a large kind of Muslim vote in the left. Parts of the Labour Party now are virtually controlled by Islamic groups in cities across England and Scotland as well. And it's quite disturbing. I know a lot of Jewish people in this country are terrified. There's been all sorts of attacks. Just this last week, we had a Jewish Conservative MP whose office had been firebombed, saying that he was going to be stepping down because it was just too frightening now. I've spoken to Jewish friends who are thinking about leaving the country. It's a really sinister turn of events in this country, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah, we have got the protests here, but not at that scale, thank goodness. David Maddox, thanks for your time. Thank you, David. All right, after the break. Calls yet again for a tax on sugary drinks. Now, what strikes me as truly bizarre here is we love to tax everything that's legal, cigarettes, and now we're talking to, soft drinks and cordials, but we seem to be going soft on all the illegal stuff like heroin and ice. Plus, after that fatal stabbing of a grandmother in Queensland over the weekend, the community demands real and immediate change. All the while, that new Premier, well, he just dithers. After the break. All right, let's bring in my panel for tonight. Joining me, LNP MP Keith Pitt and Spectator Australia columnist Terry Barnes. Well, gents, welcome. We're kicking off the parliamentary week. Geez, I bet you're happy to be back, Keith. We'll start with that push from health bodies today, wanting the government to implement, we're all talking about cost of living, they want a tax on soft drinks, a 20% hike on soft drinks and cordials, all in the name of obesity. I have to say again, we're making all the illegal stuff, heroin and, ice and everything else easier to get. But when it comes to soft drinks and cigarettes, the legal stuff, we want to tax them harder and harder.
Oh, Peter, cost of living is an absolute crisis. And along comes a proposal again, and this pops up every now and again, to make food more expensive. So the proposal is to tax the Tim Tam, but the hit of heroin, that's okay. Unless, of course, you get caught, then it might cost you $100. And this is going to hit people's hip pockets again. And whatever happened to freedom of choice? Unfortunately, I don't mind an ice cream, and every now and again I'll eat a pie. But they're my choices, and they're the ones that I make, and I'm entitled to make them, as is all of your viewers. So I think this proposal, once again, is just mad, and I think we're much better with an education program instead.
Terry, you're a health policy expert. I'll tell that at the top of the show so people understand where you're coming from. But, when I was a kid growing up, you got a bit of soft drink on your birthday, maybe Christmas. It certainly wasn't every day. Mum would say, there's an apple and there's the tap if you're thirsty. Kids don't have pocket money unless mum and dad give it to them, and parents are responsible for what's in their fridge. Why can't we just say no to kids if we're worried about fat children?
Oh, absolutely, Peter. Everything in moderation, that's my motto, but the public health poobahs, they always think that we are incapable of making informed choices on our own. They think that they know best and that we must do what they say. And they think that penalising us by sin taxes, such as a tax on sugary soft drinks or cigarettes or alcohol, whatever it happens to be, is actually going to drive our behaviour. But if you look at things like smoking rates, for instance, tobacco excise has gone through the roof in the last decade or so, but the hardcore smokers just keep on doing it. The only addiction that this deals with is government's addiction to revenue.
Yeah, I think it's crazy. We'll tax coke, but we'll make cocaine easier to get at a festival. I don't understand it. Keith, this horrific news out of Queensland. A woman stabbed in front of her 6-year-old grandchild. If that wasn't bad enough, comes the news today that the person they've arrested is a 15-year-old boy. Enough's enough.
Peter, enough. It was enough when 3 innocent people were killed by a young teen driving a stolen car near Maryborough last year. It was enough when an elderly lady was raped in a park in Townsville. It was enough, it was enough, it was enough. And now we have another grieving family. I think everything should be on the table here. The youth crime crisis in Queensland is completely out of control. And these kids are literally being picked up in the morning and they're getting released in the afternoon and they're back out doing it because there simply is no penalty. And I think the people of Queensland are over it. They want to see law and order. And I think for these kids who think they can get away with anything they like, There has to be an absolute crackdown, and I just feel so sorry for that family. That could have been my mum, it could have been yours, it could have been anyone's grandparents, and another innocent life has been lost because Queensland Labor won't act.
And I say to Queensland, do not be as stupid as the Victorians who put Daniel Andrews back in and wanted things to change, but did the same thing. Let's hope Queenslanders show some mettle and throw this mob out, because I think that's the only way you're going to get change. Gas the Jews, Terry. I mean, I'm not an old lady. My hearing's pretty good. The police at the time didn't say it wasn't gas the Jews. I think everyone who listens to that audio reads and hears gas the Jews. But now we're told it wasn't, because a so-called expert the police used said, no, they're saying was, where are the Jews? Where are the Jews?
Well, that's right. And as you say, I mean, witnesses as well as the audio says otherwise. But look, I think the 9th of October is a national shame we should all be absolutely ashamed of. If you go back to what happened at the Sydney Opera House when Jewish Australians were warned to stay away after the atrocities of 7th October, they wanted to come out, but they couldn't. But more to the point, I think whether it was gas the Jews or where's the Jews, I mean, it sounded to me like the baying of a lynch mob. I mean, if you go back to the where's the Jews, do you remember that incident that happened, I think, in Kazakhstan later in October, where a mob converged on the airport, hoping to bail up Jews, but getting out of an Israeli aircraft? I mean, that was a lynch mob ready to happen, and the way that mob in Sydney behaved on the 9th of October was exactly the same. And I think I'm even more ashamed of it, because if you go back, I think that incident in Sydney actually gave licence around the Western world to anti-Semites to come out in numbers.
I think you're absolutely true. Hey, Keith, some horrific information out today, if you care about where our country's headed. Our debt, we're told, is on track to reach $1.4 trillion during this financial year. So this financial year, not in the never, never. And let's not forget, of course, most of it's borrowed money. It could blow out to $1.75 trillion, we're told, by 2027, 58% of the nation's GDP.
Oh, Peter, don't forget also that there's a forecast of an additional $400 billion into the government's coffers. And they've been out there, Catherine King in particular, cancelling projects left, right and centre for infrastructure like roads and dams and gas pipelines and things that we need. And instead they're going to spend tens of billions of dollars on transmission lines and intermittent wind and solar and subsidies and all of those types of things. They put in cuts to defence. We actually need more money in defence, not less. And yet this government is just addicted to spending, and they are picking the wrong projects and they are backing the wrong issues. And in my view, even if they manage to get a balanced budget, it will be an absolute miracle. But you can be sure Jim Chalmers will use it for one thing, Peter, and that is his absolute ambition to be Prime Minister and destroy Anthony Albanese, no matter what the cost.
Terry, just before we go, Vic police officers are participating in a big Melbourne Gay Pride March on the weekend. Ugly attacks from protesters, pretty awful towards the police. Yes, it should be called out. But I've got to say, now that we've got gay marriage in this country, do we really need all these gay pride events? Do we need, months of gay pride and all these marches? Isn't it time to move on?
Yeah, well, first thing, I think what happened yesterday in Melbourne was absolutely deplorable, and those protesters need to have the book thrown at them. In terms of what you say, yes, look, I think if anybody is equal these days, it's the gay community. I mean, more equal than others, one would say. So I think in that sense, let's just getting on with being who we are and just getting on with everybody else instead of virtue signalling and identity politics left, right and centre.
Hear, hear. Terry Barnes, Keith Pitt. Have a good week, Keith. We'll see you again next week. All right, that's it for me. See you tomorrow night at 6. Here's the Bolt Report.